Do you vomit data at people or do you tell stories? Hi there, I'm Greg Venning and welcome to the Questing Chiropractor. And in this special episode of the podcast, we have Eilidh Venning joining us for a conversation about the potent power of stories in your chiropractic practice. Now, Eilidh, who does share my surname, brings an intimate understanding of the chiropractic journey, not as a practitioner, but as somebody who's deeply woven into the fabric of chiropractic. Today, we're exploring a slightly different territory, revealing how stories shape our practice, connect us with the people we serve, and reflect our essence as chiropractors. This episode is a must-listen for chiropractors looking to enhance their practice with the timeless art of storytelling, creating deeper connections, fostering a sense of community. Join us as we uncover the power of stories in the realm of chiropractic and how they can amplify our impact and enrich our professional journeys. Welcome to the Questing Chiropractor podcast. We help you grow as visionary, vital, and capable chiropractors who are always on. We do things differently as we help to elegantly awaken your innate wisdom within. We help you create robust, predictable, and trustworthy practices that serve oceans of people and yet still have free time for yourselves and your families. We use neuroscience to deliver better business results so that you can get greater, deeper, and more effective impact in more ways. We are Questing Chiropractors, and this is our story. So welcome to the Questing Chiropractor podcast. And today we have Eilidh Venning with us. And once again, you'll realize that Eilidh's surname is the same as mine, or mine is the same as hers. So welcome back, Eilidh.
It's great to be back. Thank you for having me back.
And this time we decided to record the podcast in the same rooms. I don't know if you know this, but as we record the podcast for audio, we also record for video as well. And we're feeling a bit weird having a conversation face to face, but also having a camera recording us. But we'll see how this goes. It's an exploration.
It feels a bit strange.
Yeah. So the great thing is that people are listening to us mainly. And so wherever you look, it's okay, sweets.
Thanks.
So Eilidh and I were talking about what would be useful for our Questing chiropractors to listen to, what would be a useful message for them to hear. And your great idea was that the power of stories, I think, is underappreciated in practice nowadays. And you've used the power of stories for so many years in chiropractic. What, since 2001 you've been involved in chiropractic?
Oh, gosh, I don't know. About 20 years now.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And you're not a qualified chiropractor. However, you have the chiropractic essence within you because you've been around it for so long. You get it, you live it. And so I think you tell stories really well and you spread the chiropractic message really well. You're one of the main people who's referred people into our practice, and you've inspired so many people in the chiropractic story. Why do you think stories work so well?
I think just because stories are in our DNA. Like every evolution of human, every evolution of mankind has told stories. It's how we communicate. Hugely how we communicate is through stories. And it's a massive part of communication.
And it is very primal to us. And I think as practicing chiropractors who've gone through university, which is drilled into us about data and evidence, which is useful, it sometimes makes it very hard for us to just tell a simple story when we have so much jargon, so much data, so much research. And so many times we're justifying it to ourselves, not to the person in front of us.
Yeah. And so many times I see chiropractors trying to tell a story, but telling it, so trying to tell a story to a practice member or somebody who's not involved with chiropractic. And when they start to tell the story, their chiropractor head comes on and they tell the story with all their fancy Latin words and all these medical terms and people just want the basic story. They want the human story, that human connection, not the medical connection. That's why they came to a chiropractor, for the human connection. They didn't come to them for the medical connection. If they want that, they can go somewhere else. But So, just that connection is a big part of what builds your practice as well. That most of the time, people will come to see you for you, not for what you do. They'll come to see you because they resonate with you and the things that you've done and the stories that you've told them. And a lot of the time they actually come for your CA and the stories they tell them and the things that they've done. And so that's why stories play this huge part in practice. And a huge part in bringing people into your practice and spreading the message of chiropractic and doing it in a way that doesn't confuse people, that puts it down in plain language and also in a way that people can connect with. Hearing stories about other people makes you want to do things.
Yeah.
Yeah.
The element of connection here is so strong because it's the right brain concept of connection, where the left brain jargon thing is very disconnective. And that's what the left brain does. It takes things apart to be able to understand them, but it doesn't put them back together again. And so when we're telling stories from the right brain perspective, we're doing the human connection, and that's putting things and communities back together again.
Yeah, I actually read a post on social media recently, and it was actually this morning, and it was a chiropractor who was explaining something, and they said in simple terms, and then they went on to use all these big fancy words and everything, and I was like, it's not simple. Like, you really actually do need to make it more simple for people.
We get in our own
Because
way.
as soon as you start using those words, people just gloss over and they don't hear the rest of the story.
Yeah.
And that might be the only word that you use in there that they wouldn't understand, but that was one of the first words that you used, so they just switched off straight away.
Yeah. Okay. So let's come back to stories, and it's really important to know what story we're telling ourselves about what we do. And so that touches a little bit on our beliefs about ourselves. And so what have you found that's useful and what have you found that's not useful amongst chiropractors in terms of the stories they tell themselves?
Oh, that's a good question.
Yeah.
So I think starting off with the story of why they came to chiropractic is a really good place to start. So going back to the basics of why did you become a chiropractor? So you might be saying, I want to do this for this, this, and this reason. But actually, if you go back to why you decided, when was that first moment that you said, I want to be a chiropractor? Was it the first time that you went to your chiropractor and you had an adjustment and your chiropractor planted that little seed? It might have been when you were a baby, it might have been when you were going through your younger years, your teenage years, even when you were a grown adult and in another profession. And somebody said, you know what, you would make a really, really good chiropractor. And when did that light bulb moment, when did that happen? And that, I think a lot of chiropractors forget that moment. And that is where their essence comes from.
So when we're helping chiropractors to get back into connection with what makes their heart sing about being in practice, by being a chiropractor, and we help them to define a vision and a purpose and a mission, this is where we take that's where we take them a lot, oftentimes, is to reconnect with the why you got there in the first place.
Yeah.
And then there's the story of what chiropractic is from there and what it is to you, how that's evolved through your study years and your practice years. And that can muddy the water sometimes and take away from that elegant simplicity of why did you get in the first place? And often the answer is, well, to help people. But that's really a surface layer answer. There's often so much more underneath that that's worth unpacking.
Yeah.
Okay, so for listeners, that's a great place to start, is if you're thinking about the power of stories and how this can help you to grow a practice, to be more fulfilled in practice, then what story are you telling yourself around why you're there in the first place, your purpose? Okay. From there, if we take concentric circles out, whether it's one chiro or multiple chiros, we then ask, well, what's the story of the practice as a as a practice and as a team. So, like, what have you seen work? What have you seen not work when we're thinking about the story of the team?
So I think sitting with each individual member of the team and finding out what their story is can have a huge impact on the rest of the team, especially when you're bringing a new person into the fold. So you often forget to tell that new person your chiropractic beginnings story. But when we bring somebody new into the fold in the practice, one of the first things I encourage them to do is sit with each other member of the team and find out their beginnings. So their why, their how they came to this practice. It might have just been upon chance, and how that story has then blossomed and grown from there. It might have been in another way that they were thrown into this team. And I think it's really important to understand that, and then it then becomes a shared story. And it creates this cohesiveness. And because you know that other person's story, when something comes up in practice, you can tell little bits of that story to then to others, to the practice members, obviously the bits that you have permission to share, and then that becomes part of their journey too. And
We share
then
stories.
and we share stories, and then they share that story, and then they share that story, and it has this ripple effect. We've been talking about this recently, about how the words that you say and the things that you say has this ripple effect beyond this conversation between two people, and how it can affect our conversations, can affect our children, can affect the practice, can affect our children's friends, can affect our greater families, our friends, the school community, to eventually become the whole community. And who knows how far those ripples can then flow out.
Constructive and destructive ripples go that way.
Yes.
Okay. So let's come back to, like, stories are a primal thing. We know neurologically that what stories do is they bypass part of our critical rational barrier, and they go really deep into our subconscious, because they're these primal things we've been doing around campfires since the beginning of human time. And we actually mark the beginning of kind of human era based on stories. Like, the advent of history is the beginning of where we mark kind of humanity. That's the beginning of a story. So we then bring that really, really close, and we focus on, cool, what story we're telling ourselves. Then what story are we telling as a team? And that becomes our statement of purpose. That becomes our shared values. That becomes what is the global problem we're trying to solve? What's our unique solution? These are all elements that we call your operational cascade within Quest, but they are your chiropractic story for your practice.
Yeah. And every person's a part of that story.
Yeah, they infuse their DNA over
DNA.
time. Yeah.
Yeah. And then every time we bring somebody new into the team, we look at that and say, does this resonate with you? If not, how can we then bring your story into this?
Yeah.
Yeah. So
that's really important, because that helps us to row in the same direction. That gives us clarity of purpose. So we become purpose-driven teams within the practice. And that's really important. So that then, the reason why we have a team is so we can serve people. So we can serve our community, we can serve humankind. And so then we have to start figuring out, great, so that's our story, and that's important. But people outside don't really care that much about our story. They care about their story.
yes.
So we now want to find out, it's useful if we start finding out, well, what stories are happening around us in our community, that we can then position ourselves as a solution to their story of suffering that they have. And that's where you've been such a genius, I'd actually use the word, because you spend time on social media, and not much of it is wasted, I'd say, because what you're doing is you're on groups, you're on chats, you're reading posts, and you're not just reading a post, you're reading, like, what you give to me is you're telling me what is the theme that's coming through, and these people are now starting to talk about this. And a couple of months later, you'll say, hey, this is in conversation a lot in the community, and hey, this is in conversation. And when this topic, scoliosis, comes up, this is how people are talking about it. And so it makes it really then easy for us at the practice to go, great, chiropractor, left brain hat, pause and chiropractic human brain had, let's connect with people on this, and it makes it much easier because you've given us this intel.
So anyone else in marketing, anybody else would call it market research.
Yes.
But really for me,
research.
it's story research, it's human connection, it's trying to find out where people are looking for help and then how can we help them.
Yeah. And social media has become this massive place for sharing stories. Really, it is a story sharing set of platforms. And that story becomes the narrative. And in the area of COVID, we heard a lot about the narrative and different narratives. And really, that is story. And what we know is, in society, we know that those who tell stories win. Because those who tell story capture human hearts and human minds, and sometimes capture in a negative sense, or else enthrall and capture in a positive sense, as in get and gain people's trust and attention to be able to hear the rest of the story. Which is why we go to the movies and why we listen to podcasts and why we read books is because we are entranced by stories. So to make it really practical here, stories can also be metaphors that you can use every day in practice. So what are some valuable metaphors that maybe some listeners can take out of this as bite-sized chunks? Because we begin this big thing of what's your personal story, what's your practice story? These are big chunks. These are important chunks for listeners to get a handle on. Let's give them some bite-sized things. And I'm sure you as a listener have heard many, 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 but just here and now, what are some of the useful ones for you?
Oh my gosh, you've put me on the spot here.
Can I give you a couple that come to mind for me while you're thinking there?
I just know that these are ones that tend to, you put me on the spot, but if I was put on the spot in the practice in the moment, I would be able to come up with it. So it depends who I'm speaking to, first of all.
So let's imagine somebody's come in flustered and they say the traffic has held them up and they're in for an adjustment visit as a follow-up visit.
So let's make sure that the traffic in your nervous system is free flowing between your brain and the rest of your body, and let's get you firing on all cylinders.
And so you think of how simple, it's exactly the one I was going to tell you.
Yeah.
So you just think of how simple that was as a simple metaphor for talking about basically what you've done is you've unpacked the fact that subluxation means that things are stuck or interfered with or not flowing properly. Just like traffic is. And people will immediately think that traffic is slow and backed up, things stop, things get inflamed. There's a whole set of images and things, concepts that'll come to their mind with that.
That horn hooting, telling you there's something going on.
Sitting still, not going anywhere. And so immediately you've linked that to what a subluxation might do within the body in a metaphorical sense, and to some extent a literal sense as well. But people will draw their own connections with that. And so from then on, you've kind of done like a brain tattoo of the traffic jam is like a subluxation and free-flowing traffic is what an adjustment does. So that really simple story is immensely powerful for the conceptual processes it unlocks in people's minds. And I think that's where we sometimes get behind ourselves as practicing chiropractors is we get into the data too soon, and the data and the detail is too much too soon, where people are attracted to the concept and the conceptual understanding first. And from there, we can, over time, little chunks at a time, build in the information as is necessary. Very few people want tons of data straight up. They do exist, but there's few of them.
And over the years, I worked with many different chiropractors, and the majority of them at the beginning of their career would have sat someone down in front of them and vomited chiropractic on them and told them all the things all there then, because they have this knowledge and they have to tell you right now
the 3-hour report of findings
or else you're not going to leave here feeling that you've achieved anything. And I wouldn't have achieved anything. So but then gradually over time they realized that stories, these things, like stories, come in chapters. You don't have to have all the information right there and then. You get the information piece by piece, chapter by chapter. It's not always a single sitting story.
And that's really useful because the stories people tell themselves or the stories people tell each other about chiropractic is really important because they're coming in with a predefined story in their minds most of the time. Some of the times they might come in with a virgin story, but I don't think there is such a thing as a blank story. They'll have some concept of what's coming, and how valid or not that is interesting. I think some of the times, because sometimes chiropractic can have a lower level of brand identity out in the public, people come in with the concept that we're almost on the level of massage therapists. And I think what's quite useful is to reframe that story from their first encounter with us, from the first phone call, certainly when they first sit with us. So one of the questions we tend to suggest people use within Quest is your history form that they fill out first doesn't start with the pain question first. Where does it start first? Where the pain stuff goes at the end. Where do we sometimes start?
We start with, was your parents' pregnancy with you planned and welcomed? Because that is where your story starts, is conception, and how were you brought into this world from conception?
Yeah.
And then your story evolves from there. Your mother's pregnancy with you, the birth process with you, and then all the things that you've done, all the different chapters of your life, again, bringing it back to stories, all the different chapters of your life, each year being a chapter, each month being a chapter, each week, each day being its own separate chapters, and how they unfold throughout your life, and what's happened in those chapters, what's been discovered during that time. And then eventually we get to the pain part.
Yeah. And what that does is that reframes people's concept of what we're doing. So they don't see us as much as only about the pain thing, like that massage therapist. What they do is they then, well, first of all, they ask themselves a different question. They ask themselves the question of like, why are they asking this question?
That's normally one of the first questions we get asked on the form.
And the purpose behind that is so people start putting us in a category of one, a new category completely. They go, oh, so this is different from the last time I was at my chiro or my physio. This is different from my GP. This is different from the massage therapist. And it allows us to create a new story about what happens in our practice and what chiropractic is for people. It is a pattern interrupt, and it puts us into a new category in their minds. So that's really, really important. From there, we then discover their story. Visit 1 is all about their story. Very, very little about our practice, our chiropractic story. That comes at visit 2, but it starts with their story.
Yeah, because we want to see how best we can match their story.
Yeah.
How can we help them? And the only way that we can know that is if we know what their story is.
Yeah. So I guess that rounds us back to marketing, and I'm aware of time, so this will be the last bit that we chat about in this podcast. And I think this has been massively useful so far, just for me doing this. But all of marketing is telling stories, and whether marketing is allowed in different ways in your jurisdiction that you're in. Your marketing can be your website. It can be a Google ad you use. It can be a Facebook post. It can be just the way your website looks and feels, the words you use, what you say. It can be, you can go out and do talks and screenings, whatever your form of making your services known is. Let's put that into the big bundle of marketing now. All of marketing is telling a story. Sometimes you have 140 characters to tell a story. Sometimes you have 3 words to tell a story. Sometimes you have pages and paragraphs to tell a story. Where would you suggest listeners start if they're realizing this now and they go, oh crap, what story am I telling? Starting from the idea that we've done some marketing research. We know the audience that we're going to be addressing. That's kind of the first thing in marketing is, who am I talking to? What platform am I talking to them on? And then you kind of get into the message. So if you were going to write an article for a blog on a website and maybe a physical article in practice, where would you start that process? Because now you've got a chance to tell a story.
So I start with finding out who it is that I want to speak to, and then with the topic of it, and then I I do as much research as I can on that topic, on that subject. Find out as much information about it and find out what other people are asking about it. So what questions are people asking on scoliosis? What questions are people asking on headaches? And you can use Google Analytics. There's special there's websites that you can use to create, I don't know, is it spider diagrams of the search terms that people are looking for. So you can start there and find out what questions people are asking about that. On a more kind of local level, you can be part of the groups and the pages and the whatever else it is that people go to share stories and ask questions and just keep an eye on there and find out where these questions, this topic has been coming up before. So is there a local headache and migraine clinic? Is there a local page for people who suffer from migraines they're looking for some emotional support and some local support on this? Are there like off the top of my head again, I can't think of anything specific.
We can edit out.
And just finding out where people are hanging out and where people are talking about these things, and then you hang out there too, whether it's digitally or in person, and you listen. You be a fly on the wall. You observe. You find out what it is that they're talking about. And don't be a creep about it. Do actually speak up at some point and do say something. But yeah, like find out where people are telling stories and listen.
The one of the keys you said in the beginning that is listening, and you said something about finding out what questions they're asking. And I think that's so important because that's really the beginning of a story, is the question that's being asked, the questions that's being framed. If you think about almost any movie or story or book or whatever you can think of, is there's an opening scene and then something happens and it leaves us with a question. That's the beginning part of every story. Then there's some data, then there's some connection, and then the story can get big. So I think the beginning of every story is what is the question people are asking if we're thinking about a marketing perspective? Because then if we are able to answer that question, be a solution to that problem, we can position ourselves better because we know our own story and now we know their story. And now we can blend the two if they do blend. And then it comes across as an authentic offer of help rather than a sleazy sale hit. The uninvited sleazy sale hit is when it's jarred, it's unexpected, it doesn't match. That's not a problem I have.
Yeah.
But when it's, hey, how did you know? That's where you have a very different response from the prospective person who's outside the practice and looking to come in then. Because then they know that they are praying for the solution. They've been praying for a solution to this problem. And now they know that yours might be the solution they're praying for. They didn't know what solution they were praying for, but now they know that yours might be it.
And the best way to find out is to ask them a question.
Yeah. So powerful to ask questions, which is kind of the opposite of what we sometimes do when we're like you said, vomiting that information back out on people. But I think that's a useful analogy. That's a story in itself. That whole thing is a story in itself. So I think that's really useful. Thank you very much for this time, Eilidh. I think our listeners will get a lot out of the idea that stories are so important and all the different levels of stories we've gone through today. So thank you very much for joining us.
It's a pleasure. And maybe on a future podcast, then we can get all the Quest coaches together and everyone shares their beginning story.
Oh, that would be really cool. So if you've been listening to this and you found this useful, I bet you one of your friends or colleagues would also find it useful. So please do share this with them. Let's make sure that we're empowering the chiropractic profession as much as possible. And stories are a massive part of spreading the word so that we can do the amazing things that we do in practice every day. Thank you.